I am here with Eric Metaxas, and Eric, it is always such a pleasure to chat with you. And today we're talking about your new book, Is Atheism Dead? Now, what compelled you to write this book?
This is a strange story in a way. I met a man in Albuquerque. That sounds like a Johnny Cash song, right? I met a man in Albuquerque who my friend, the pastor Skip Heitzig, told me had discovered biblical Sodom. And I said, what did you say? Why have I not read about this? Because Sodom, this is 1700 BC. It's like the first couple of pages of the Bible. You're telling me we have archaeological evidence of this? Yes. So I looked into it. It was amazing. I mean, it was amazing. It's more than amazing. It's astonishing. I met a man in Houston named James Moore. He is one of the top nanoscientists on planet Earth, probably the top, but he won't say that. He starts talking to me about stuff in his field. He's a believer, profound Christian. And he starts saying that, you know, he knows so much about what happens and what is possible at the molecular level, that the idea that life came into being 4 billion years ago on Earth by random processes is more than absurd. It's offensive and it's so ridiculous now that we know what we know from science. In other words, 70 years ago when they postulated this, they did some experiments in the University of Chicago. You could see how that level of scientific ignorance would lead them to believe that any minute now we're going to figure out how cells came into being. Well, he says, now we know after 70 years that not only haven't we gotten closer, we've gotten infinitely farther away. The more science we know, the more we know that we know nothing about how life came into being by natural processes. And of course, it doesn't even seem possible because cells are so complicated. So the long and the short of it is I met two guys who were experts in their fields who both told me things that are nothing less than astonishing and breathtaking. And I realized nobody knows this information. And I'm a popularizer. I write books for everybody to read. You know, I'm not a scientist or an archaeologist, and I have the ability to tell stories and hopefully to make it compelling. And at the beginning of COVID, I thought maybe I should write a book that goes into all of the archaeological evidence that I have uncovered and that has been uncovered over more than 150 years, and all the scientific evidence. And the main thesis of the book, it takes its title from in 1966, when a lot of, you know, all the smart people thought, we've kind of figured it out. God doesn't exist, or he probably doesn't exist, or science is pushing him out of the picture. So Time magazine came up with a cover story that said, "Is God dead?" And that became the reigning narrative in all of our lifetimes. And so whenever information came up, people sort of batted it away. Well, I thought, bumping into my new friend in Albuquerque and bumping into my new friend in Houston and reading all the other stuff I've been reading over the years about the fine-tuned universe and all this stuff, I said, I think it's time to write a book with the title, Is Atheism Dead? Because maybe the logical question in 1966 was, is God dead? But the logical question now that science itself is pointing to the existence of God, which sounds crazy, but is true, and nobody knows it, maybe now's the time to write a book with the title, Is Atheism Dead? So that's ultimately how it came to be. I never planned to write a book like this, but I am genuinely more excited about this book and about getting the information in this book out to people than I have ever been about any book I have written. Most believers, and definitely most non-believers, don't know this information. It's because we live in a media echo chamber that tends to filter out this kind of information. By the grace of God, I've been able to stumble on this stuff and now do some more research. And I think we're at a paradigm shifting moment. And a lot of people aren't going to like it. But I think the one thing everybody kept saying, science is leading us away from religion. Ironically, in the last 50 years, precisely the opposite has happened. Science is leading us to God. It's big news. And so that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, that's amazing. Now, identify some of the most compelling evidence out there that proves that science is in fact compatible with scripture?
Well, there are a couple of main points to be made. First of all, we've all lived at a time when not only is the trend that science is pointing us away from God, but we've been living for over 100 years with the narrative that says science is fundamentally at odds with faith, that reason is at odds with religion. That narrative has been happening since about 1859, when Darwin wrote his Origin of the Species, and it kind of worked its way into the scientific world and then dribbled down culture into the culture, the trickle down theory. So that idea that science is fundamentally at odds with faith that we've all been living with is a complete lie. And this doesn't just mean that science is pointing to God. I'm going past that. I'm here to say that science has never been at odds with faith in the God of the Bible. That's a lie. The founding myth of atheism that everybody talks about, Galileo versus the church, he was some brave scientist versus the people of faith, complete nonsense. He was a profound Christian who himself knew there could never be any daylight between what we discover in science and what the scripture says. Truth is truth. So this idea that faith and science are at odds, the biggest news is that not only is that not true, there are two things that follow, actually. Let's say three. The first is that's not true. The second is, according to John Lennox, whom I quote in my book, it is actually atheism that is incompatible with science, which is a dramatic statement. But the third thing, which nobody seems to know, but it's true, is that Christian faith led to modern science. So far from this idea that science is at odds with faith, it is literally Christian faith that led to modern science. I go into that in the book. This is an historical fact. This is not some Christian gloss on history. It is true. And it is such a wild contradiction to everything we keep hearing over and over and over again, that I said, it's going to take time to digest this. This is a paradigm shift. Most of the greatest scientists in history, up until, roughly the 20th century, but the people who invented modern science, almost every single one of them was a profound Christian believer. Maxwell, one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, only Einstein and Isaac Newton could even compare with him. He was probably the strongest believer of them all. And Einstein once was told, "You stand on the shoulders of Newton." And he says, "No, I don't. I stand on the shoulders of Maxwell." Maxwell, and in my book, I write about all of these believers because I think it's important for us to know the history. But Maxwell and Newton were profound men of Christian faith, as were Boyle and Kepler and Copernicus and Galileo, and on and on and on. So it's all really, really big news. When you get down to, okay, what is science saying? That's almost the easy part. What science is pointing us to God? And I'll just say that Christopher Hitchens was once asked, what is the number one argument from the God side against atheism? And in a rare moment of candor, because he could be very nasty in debating and dealing with Christians and people of faith, he said, without question, the fine-tuned argument, the idea that science, and this is science lately, only in the last 50 or so years, is discovering things about our universe, about the earth, about human life, about cellular life, that looks so fine-tuned, so perfectly calibrated that it couldn't be a little bit this way or a little bit this way. It has to be exactly this, that even atheists are being shaken, that's the one thing that they don't know quite how to handle it. What they do normally is just mock it, and that's happened to me because I've written about it before. They just mock it or say it's stupid. But Christopher Hitchens, who is smarter than all of them, he, in a moment of candor, said, no, that is the argument.
Now, Eric, why is it so important for Christians to know this and to believe this and to not just sit on the sidelines?
I think the truth is the truth. And I think even Christians sometimes buy into a secular narrative. Like we'll say, like, I believe in Jesus, I believe in the Bible. But if somebody says to you, well, is it consonant with science? They would say, well, I don't know. I just believe. And I think we have to understand that's not the kind of belief God is interested in. He doesn't tell you to believe in something that is not true to the bottom. He is truth. There are no non-overlapping magisteria, as Stephen Gould said. There's the science and then there's faith. That's nonsense. Either Jesus rose from the dead bodily or he didn't. Either what the Bible says is true or it isn't. Either the Lord created the universe and every detail in it, or they didn't. So this idea that we would sort of put our faith as Christians, like kind of in a corner, we're participating in the marginalization of our faith. And our faith is supposed to touch everything: science, math, history. We need to be much bolder and saying, if this is true, it is true everywhere. God is truth. He invented reality. He invented the world that we can examine, science. So we have often bought into that narrative. And I think once you understand that science, now think about this, today science is pointing to faith. 100 years ago, you could see how people got very confused because there wasn't such evidence. But think of the irony that the more advanced science gets, the more it points to the idea that there had to be a creator who created the universe. The evidence is so overwhelming, honestly, that it's shocking. I have to say it's breathtaking, and it makes you realize God is even more amazing than any of us could ever dream. And that's to me the big takeaway, that the more you study from science, the more you think, oh my goodness, who did this? I knew God was great, but I'm numb with fear at the level of genius and intelligence of the God that we talk about. It's just beyond anything we can imagine. And science is helping us to see it.
Yeah, that's remarkable. So as you researched for this book, you said you were in awe of God and just in wonder at his creation. But what was the most intriguing discovery you made?
There are so many that it's actually tough. I promise you, people will read this book and they won't believe some of this because you just can't believe you've not heard it before. One of the things is water. The simplest thing, nobody would ever dream that you're going to examine water and think, oh my goodness, this is insane. But the chemical composition of water is what makes it do what almost nothing ever does. When it becomes a solid, it floats. It doesn't sink the way most things do, get heavier and sink. So when water gets colder and colder and colder, it does get denser and denser and denser and heavier and heavier and heavier until it hits 39 degrees Fahrenheit. And then suddenly it flips. And from 39 degrees to 32 degrees, when it freezes, it becomes less dense. So that by the time it freezes and becomes a solid, it is less dense than the liquid and it floats. And because it floats, there's life on Earth. And that's a whole other conversation. There's a chapter on it in the book. But scientists say this. They say that the composition of the water molecule, it's really bizarre. It has this strange polarity. Other scientists say that, you could almost look at a molecule and know roughly what the melting temperature would be, roughly what the boiling temperature would be. Water breaks every rule. It doesn't make any sense. I discovered that erosion, nobody thinks of erosion as a positive thing, right? Erosion is another thing God designed. Water is just viscous enough that when it runs over rocks and things, it picks up the particulates of the metal and the minerals in the rock. It's eroding the rock. While it does that, it carries the metal and the minerals wherever it goes, and therefore feeds the plants. They need the minerals, they need the metals and things. Wherever water runs, because of erosion, it's carrying these nutrients with it. If it were slightly less viscous, that wouldn't work. Who would ever dream that the viscosity of water or that erosion would be something that when you really look into it, you think, oh my goodness, this is crazy. If it were slightly different, there would probably be no life on Earth. There'd be no possibility to feed all these plants. And then guess what? The animals eat the plants and the animals get the nutrition. So that's just one tiny thing, but it goes on and on and on. And I'm referring to the water thing because it's the one thing that I wouldn't even dream that I would have written a chapter on water. on how amazing water is. There's a thing in there too about we all think like, okay, erosion. So now erosion's a positive thing, and God is using erosion, and he invented water to erode rocks, to feed animals and to feed plants. And what I never knew that. And then you start looking into it and you realize that water erodes so powerfully that every mountain on earth should have been eroded down to nothing many times over.
Mm.
But why didn't that happen? Because God created plate tectonics, which we didn't really understand until the 1960s. And plate tectonics, the plates moving, create mountains. So things are eroding, things are rising up as they're eroding. The more you look, the more you think this is the most complex thing, and God did it. And if it were the tiniest bit different, there would be no life on earth. But believe me, I'm just hitting a couple of tiny things. It goes on and on and on. That's why I said I really need to write a book about this, because every believer needs to understand how freakish it is. I mean, for you to study science, the more you look, the more you just think, I almost can't bear this. The evidence of God is just, I never even dreamt that I would find it. And it is everywhere I look, including in things like water and erosion.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like every day there is a new archaeological discovery proving that biblical accounts in the Old Testament are true. But, you know, regardless of how much proof is out there for intelligent design,
Right,
like that God created the universe, there's always, why is there always going to be a resistance to that truth?
It's the mystery of iniquity. The Lord has us behind enemy lines where we are fallen and subject to self-interest and want that away truth that makes us uncomfortable. I think in these last days, as things unravel around the world, God is shining his light brighter and brighter. He's allowing us to discover things via science and via archaeology, like the discovery of biblical Sodom, which I mentioned, which were unthinkable. And I think it simply gets harder and harder to deny him. There will always be people who will, you know, and that's heartbreaking. But of course, God will just keep pushing out this evidence. He tries to help us, tries to give us evidence. But you know, at the end of the day, it's got to be the Holy Spirit. We understand that. But the more you know about the preposterousness of the atheist worldview, the more you know about how science is pointing us to God and how most of this evidence is unknown. I mean, again, that's why I put it in this book. I said, we have got to get this evidence out first to the church. But I mean, I write all my books so they can be shared with non-believers. And I'm not saying go to some hardcore atheist, because maybe they have an animus against faith and nothing can convince them. But there are a lot of good people that don't believe the way we do. They have real questions and they don't know where to look. They're not going to read some hyper-Christian book. They figure, well, that's not for me. I've written this book, you know, pretty much for anybody with an open mind. And when I talk about the first part of the book is science, and there's a lot of science stuff, which we're not going to get into today. There's a lot of archaeology stuff, some really funny, crazy stories in the archaeology stuff, just amazing stories that usually if you read an archaeology book, they won't tell you the story. They just tell you the facts. The stories are hilarious. And then the third part of the book, I deal with atheism itself. I deal with the new atheists who have been intellectually very shallow and dishonest. I really take them to task, because serious atheists like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Anthony Flew, people who really looked into the bleakness of the abyss of a world without God and meaning, most of them were either deeply troubled by it instead of happy. And the three that I just mentioned, there's a chapter in the book, and this is almost unbelievable again. You think, how did we not know this? But Anthony Flew, many people knew that. But Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, two of the most thoughtful philosophical atheists of the 20th century, both of them at the end of their lives independently came to faith in God. That to me is just a mind-blowing headline. Almost nobody knows that. I mean, virtually no one knows that. So when I discovered this, a lot of this stuff, I just felt God handed this to me. I don't know how I have the privilege of telling the world some of this information. And then, you know, I hope that it whets people's appetites to look deeper and to have confidence. People in the church especially say, you know what we believe? Guess what? It is just ridiculously true. I'm not even going to be slightly embarrassed about sharing it with somebody. If you don't believe it, you're probably the one that should be slightly embarrassed, because the facts have mounted up to a level that I don't think any of us could have dreamt. And that's literally why I wrote the book. I said, this has to get out there. It should have been out there 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but here we are.
Yeah. Well, thank you for writing something that, that is so helpful for parents too, to have some sort of defense for why we believe what we believe. And sort of on that note, you're a parent, I'm a parent, I have two little kids. You are on the front lines dealing with some of these really tough issues right now. I'd like to get your thoughts. What are some issues that parents need to be aware of, especially that might be coming up in future years? What should we be concerned about? What should we be vigilant about that maybe we're not being vigilant about?
Well, I think part of the reason I wrote the book also is to say to people, hey, this is not a philosophy. Our faith is not a truth. This is truth. And God is giving this to us so that we can be emboldened. And when we speak out against ridiculous things like critical race theory, anything that smacks of cultural Marxism, reject it with everything you have. Homeschool your kids. Sam Sorbo is a tremendous resource. Sam Sorbo has a website. She's, of course, the wife of Kevin Sorbo, or Hercules, depending on how you know him. But homeschooling, I think that you could do a bad job homeschooling, and that would be an infinitely better education than most of the education kids are getting in public schools or even in private schools, and even sometimes in Christian schools. You have to be aware, because a lot of them are very naively going woke. I think you have to reject the transgender bandwagon. These are things that are being foisted on us with a kind of a rapidity that should make everybody know something's wrong. They don't want us to know the truth. Whether you're talking about vaccines, election fraud, we're living in times where we can no longer trust journalists the way we did. We can no longer trust doctors the way we did. It's sad, but it has woken up the church. It's waking up the church. People need to be awake, and they need to know, in my Bonhoeffer book, I deal with this. The church was slow to wake up. And that is the model of what not to do. If we do not wake up and fight, and there are a lot of Christians who have bad theology that says, oh, I don't think I'm supposed to fight. That not only is that not biblical, that's demonic. God calls us to fight evil. He calls us to fight on our knees in prayer, but he also calls us to fight in all kinds of other ways, getting involved. Bonhoeffer was like a voice, like an Old Testament prophet, and the church of his day did not heed his advice until it was too late. And so you want to say to people, hey, if you don't spend your money for God's purposes today, if you have money, a lot of money, you may not even have that money a few years from now. It'll be taken away from you. If you have a voice and you can speak freely, it might cost you something, but if you don't use that voice now, you may not have that voice in a year or 3 years. The church needs to stand and fight right now on every level. And if you're a parent, I would say definitely get involved in school boards. Don't let anybody ever intimidate you. Do not let them do that. They're afraid of you, which is why they're threatening you. Get involved. And if God calls you to homeschool or to do something like that, there are innumerable possibilities, but do not let your kids get near this stuff. The hour is late, and we need to get really serious. I also believe God is going to turn things around, but his church has to fight. We have to stand and fight. We have to be armed, with information. On the science thing, just what I write about in this book, it almost cracks me up. I'm thinking, tell me where I'm missing something here. I know I'm not, because I got all this information from scientists. So people are gaslighting us that Christians have their weird views. It is nonsense. We have to be bold. We have to know what we believe, and we have to act. And if you don't do it for yourself, do it for your kids and your grandkids.